Episode 7. Lobbying and the Law. Should a lobby group have been able to embed itself in the heart of government, in workplaces across the country, in hospitals, police services, and in broadcasters like the BBC?
This is just a really unprecedented situation, and I'm like you, I'm at a bit of a loss to know how this has happened.
And are Stonewall correctly interpreting the law? The Equality Act protects people who are reassigning their gender from male to female or vice versa. But Parliament has never created new genders. Never. Equality law does not give an individual the legal right to be formally recognised as non-binary or genderqueer, for example. And yet, Stonewall has managed to convince major organisations throughout the UK to believe otherwise.
I've had different viewpoints advocated to me about what is or is not required by law.
The existence of multiple genders is disputed and is a matter of opinion. And yet some people would argue the BBC has seemingly thrown its impartiality out the window. Is it pushing Stonewall's political agenda onto children? Has Stonewall's policy on multiple genders been promoted by the BBC's children's programming? This is from a BBC Teach website.
What are the different gender identities?
That's a really, really exciting question to ask.
Do you know there are so many gender identities? So we know we've got male and female, but there are over 100, if not more, gender identities now.
We are in a moment of transition of political ideas.
They didn't see anything wrong with what they were being told. Oh, there are all these gender identities and so on and so forth. But they didn't dig deep.
This is not just about trans rights. This is about women's rights. This is about children's rights. This is about public discussion and democracy.
We will look at how controversial this territory is and ask why your public institutions seem to have blindly followed the ideas that Stonewall promotes.
And one person even said to me, I thought that, but I knew I wasn't allowed to think it.
I'm speechless, Stephen. You couldn't write this.
Oh, come on! I remember. I've been through this. No, you hold on a minute.
I'm invested with mate.
The ordinary working class people here, taxi drivers, hairdressers, the guys who own bars who couldn't get open.
Call 03030 80 55 55.
You're off on the wrong track.
I'm not off on the wrong track. We've all been through this. Sorry, not tonight, lads. Just enough time to remind you of that magic email, nolan@bbc.co.uk. Some of the biggest stories there have ever been over recent years have started off from that email, nolan@bbc.co.uk. Have a good day today. We'll see you back here on Nolan at 9 tomorrow morning. Bye-bye.
The day ahead of me is going to be torturous. I just wish I'd been more organised as I went along. Just trying to pull together all of the various documents that we have around the Equality Act, which is going to be no mean feat. So there's absolute mountains of paperwork here on the floor, in the cupboards. I've lost complete track of how many FOIs we've put in now. We're probably talking about 30 or more at this stage. The Equality Act was a big part of Stonewall's lobbying, and it was how they interpreted a particular part of the Equality Act which guarantees rights based on gender reassignment. And when Stonewall are talking to all these organisations, they're saying they're changing the language very subtly to gender identity, and then that obviously opens up a whole other set of rights and responsibilities for those employers if they interpret it that way. So we're trying to find out, is that legal and is that right, and why did those organisations agree to it, basically.
Some trans people are protected in law, but there is a formal process, and it protects people transitioning from male to female or vice versa. In UK law, sex is binary. There is male and there is female, and people who are transitioning. But what it means to be trans for many people now is not that simple. Some people who come under what Stonewall call the trans umbrella have no gender. Some have varying identities. Non-binary, gender fluid, gender queer, trans queer, two-spirit.
Probably couldn't give you the dictionary definition of it.
But just, can you give me a sense of what it means? So if someone comes to me...
What you can't do under the current law is self-identify your gender. But that's what Stonewall want. So a man cannot just say, I'm a woman, and have all the rights and protections of being female. However, this investigation is evidence of public bodies taking their lead from Stonewall rather than the law. Many public organisations allow people to define themselves as male, female, trans queer, gender fluid, gender queer, two-spirit, non-binary.
That is something for politicians to consider with changes to the Equality Act or things like the Gender Recognition Act, both of which...
And shouldn't Stonewall just lobby for that? Shouldn't they just say, let's change the Equality Act and let's
protect...
No,
what I'm saying to you is that
identities.
you said official definitions. There aren't official definitions.
Please, Benjamin, tell me before you go what genderqueer is. I have no notion. And if you can change whenever and however you like, that means biological men have access to female showers and toilets.
How are those employers not leaving themselves open to a court case from the other side, from people who say, you are infringing on my sex-based rights?
Self-ID means biological men could play for female sports teams. Here's Darren Grimes on Talk TV Radio.
So male-born sex offenders who self-identify as women can be placed on female-only NHS wards. That's what hospital trusts have actually put forward in their guidance.
The Equality Act became law in 2010 to legally protect people from discrimination in the workplace and in wider society. The Act outlines a series of protected characteristics to prevent people from being unfairly treated.
The bill introduces the concept of protected characteristics of age, disability, gender reassignment, marriage and civil partnership, pregnancy and maternity, race, religion and belief, sex and sexual orientations.
At the heart of the current row over sex and gender identity is the protected characteristic under the law of gender reassignment. Specifically, how Stonewall are interpreting this aspect of the law and how they are advising your institutions, your workplaces. What effect does that have on your rights? Your rights enshrined in law, like single-sex spaces. James Caspian is a psychotherapist and expert in transgender issues, and he's worked within the field for over a decade. Why do you think so many public bodies who are open, who are transparent, accept Stonewall as, quote, the experts or their advisors?
One thing that happened was when the Equality Act came in and organisations looked around for someone to advise them or to provide training, there was hardly anybody that could do it. And the reason for that was that it's such a small field that there are very few people that are associated in it. So virtually anybody, especially somebody with a brand like Stonewall, who came along and said, well, we know about experts on this, we'll tell you. Of course, then the organisations would breathe a sigh of relief and say, thank you very much, come in and do that.
So obviously there's going to be a tension between what the law actually says and what groups that these organisations have brought in, like Stonewall, what they lobby for, what they want. So the Scottish Government, on Stonewall's advice, removed the word mother. The Welsh Government created another protected characteristic, gender identity, and it's not in the Equality Act. That's not a protected characteristic. It's gender reassignment.
James is currently taking a case to the European Court of Human Rights to argue his right to research trans people who wish to detransition as part of his MA studies. That's people who want to reverse their sex change and return to the sex they were born.
How do you feel, James, about, from your professional perspective, about organisations, public bodies, governments, organisations like the BBC, who treat Stonewall as the experts in this area?
I think it's very unfortunate because, for one thing, nobody's actually an expert in this area. There's no solid body of knowledge or research as there are in other topics. For instance, if you wanted to say, well, who's an expert on heart surgery? You'd probably know who to turn to, and there'd be a huge body of knowledge and experience. and research on that particular subject. There isn't on this. There's really only a series of opinions and beliefs and a kind of practice that's evolved, which is based in don't discriminate against people. That's basically what it's based in. And I wouldn't ever advocate to discriminate against anybody. I think everybody should be treated equally. But I think we have to be able to think critically about a subject which is very new and about which there is no solid knowledge or research.
Kathleen Stock is a professor of philosophy at the University of Sussex.
Right, it's important that we should clarify something here, because when we recorded this interview a number of months ago, Kathleen Stock was just a professor of philosophy at the University of Sussex, gender critical views, but she has joined the LGBT Alliance, and I think it's important that we declare that.
Tell Kathleen about the civil service.
So some of the documents...
Hold on now, do you get in front of the mic?
Yeah.
He's not a presenter, Kathleen. He doesn't even speak when he's in front of the microphone, that big black thing.
I can't... Oh, are these the headphones? So some of the documents we've seen in terms of the different parts of the civil service across the UK show Stonewall asking the civil service to change their language to include gender identity when they talk about the Equality Act. And extraordinarily, in some cases, including the Welsh case, the civil servants have changed the language in their description of the Equality Act to include gender identity, which is not legislated for.
Can you remember any examples?
So what happened in Wales? So they were describing in a document for civil servants what the legislative provisions were, and it included sex, sexual orientation, and gender identity. And gender identity is not in the Equality Act, but that's what Stonewall have lobbied for.
Absolutely.
So the civil service have gone beyond what the legislators have asked them to do in terms of the law, and they have changed the language because a lobby group has asked them to.
This is not just a one-off, right? So a couple of years ago, I was involved in a grassroots campaign because people started to notice that local authorities were describing the protected characteristic as gender identity rather than reassignment. And quite often they were leaving out sex as well. So they were saying gender and gender identity. So this grassroots campaign got people to write to the local authorities and point out the law. And in many cases, it got changed. A recent case I think I saw was Ofcom have got their list of protected characteristics as including gender identity. So this is a real problem, and in my own organisation, I've tried to raise the fact that policies seem to go way beyond actual law in a way that hasn't been tested and hasn't been subject to the usual kind of legal tests, and I've got nowhere because the whole background sentiment is this is our values, this can only be good. We're doing this, we're good people, we're doing good things here, and they're just not thinking it through for its practical consequences.
We asked Labour MP Rosie Duffield if it was time for public bodies to review the policies they'd put in place based on Stonewall's advice.
Yeah, I'm afraid there is. I mean, if they are being advised erroneously by an organisation like Stonewall, then these companies need to take a step back and find out more and get more different, wider consultations so that they understand exactly what's going on, because a lobby company isn't neutral. This is what they want to happen. This is their sort of ideal, if you like, and that is not exactly what the law says. So these companies are sometimes being advised wrongly.
And governments. And I think, whatever private companies do, that's one thing, but when you have bodies like the Treasury, the Ministry of Defence, all these Whitehall departments, and they have allowed their policies, they've allowed Stonewall to advise them, surely there's a real onus on governments to now go through all of their policies and check that they're legal.
Kathleen Stock. Stonewall's advice to employers is to go above and beyond the law.
Yeah.
They say the following. They say the law and terminology around gender reassignment is outdated and doesn't reflect the full variety of experience of the trans community. The descriptive term used within legislation is gender reassignment. This is a very narrow definition of what it means to be trans. Best practice is to treat all individuals, including those who identify as non-binary, as you would other people with protected characteristics. Going above and beyond the law, the most inclusive employers consider non-binary to be a protected characteristic.
Yes, I mean, it's inexplicable to me, but this is the way these policies all read.
Kathleen argues that universities are giving protections to trans people that they do not give to other groups.
There's no other protected group in Britain that has this sort of language. We've got policies in UK universities that say any materials within relevant courses and modules will positively represent trans people and trans lives. There's no clause like that for gay people or black people or disabled people, so this is just a really unprecedented situation, and I'm like you, I'm at a bit of a loss to know how this has happened.
This Nolan Investigates podcast has obtained documentation which seems to show how the Welsh Government were persuaded by Stonewall to such an extent government policy was changed. Here's Rosie Duffield, the Labour MP.
I think that this Stonewall diversity scheme is basically it's how they would like the law to be. And I think a lot of companies and public bodies just sort of sign up to the scheme thinking that by doing so, they're compliant with current equality legislation. But it isn't quite that straightforward. And I think a lot of people have been misadvised because Stonewall are basically a lobbying group. And this is what they would like to happen. So they're giving advice based on their kind of ideals, basically, and not as the law stands at the moment.
Robin Allen QC specialises in employment and equality law.
There's nothing to stop the Welsh Government having a more inclusive set of definitions of characteristics that they consider to be important in the way that they develop policies. What they can't do is exclude characteristics from the approach that they take. As for gender identity, the Equality Act identifies a series of protected characteristics. They are limited to age, disability, gender reassignment, marriage and civil partnership, race, religion or belief, sex and sexual orientation. And the two that are important in this debate are the definition of gender reassignment and the definition of sex. And if we just take the definition of sex for a moment, because this is probably where the problem begins. It has been defined by Parliament as follows: sex in relation to the protected characteristic of sex, a reference to a person who has a particular protected characteristic, is a reference to a man or to a woman. And we sometimes call that a binary comparison. You're either a man or a woman if you're relying on the protected characteristic of sex. The complaint that is made is that insufficiently recognises the range of different identities that people may have, which are not simply male, man, and simply female, woman. And people say that they have a series of different identities that either eschew those two binary classifications or have a bit of one and a bit of the other or some combination of them.
Critics of Stonewall's policy positions, in particular around gender identity and self-identification, argue that what the Scottish and Welsh governments have done goes well beyond the law. Here's Kathleen Stock. And when, for the likes of the civil service, who will be a Stonewall champion, won't they? When you've got the civil service embracing Stonewall's policy to go above and beyond the law, how can that be healthy?
Well, it's not healthy. I mean, the law should be subject to constant scrutiny, obviously, but it should be scrutinised through standard mechanisms. It's not up to a particular lobbying group to tell all these organisations that that's what they should do. And these organisations, as you said, they just absolutely docilely repeat, parrot-like, what they're being told by Stonewall. So, I mean, that's not a healthy situation at all, particularly when these supposedly desirable changes to the law affect so many people. This is not just about trans rights. This is about women's rights. This is about children's rights. This is about public discussion and democracy. And it's being presented as a very narrow issue of no interest to anybody else. The only possible reason you could have for, being irritated about it is that you must be a bigot. That's just completely false.
Robin Allen QC.
I think that what's happening is that these two governments have been persuaded by Stonewall to use the phrase gender identity to try and take, as Stonewall would say, a more modern approach, that people's identity in the general field of gender and sex is much more fluid than simply being male or female.
But Robin, is it the case that gender identity, that they might be persuaded by Stonewall, but these governments are not required by law to do it?
No, they're not required by law to do it. In the Equality Act, no, they're not. And in Northern Ireland, as far as I'm aware, there's no specific provision that says that that's the case.
In the correspondence we've seen with Stonewall don't argue on the basis of any European Act or another act separate from the Equality Act. All they say is that the language is outdated.
Well, that's a political argument, isn't it, to say the language is outdated? Some people would agree with that. Others would say that it lacks adequate legal certainty. In discussing this topic, one of the things you have to do is to recognise that the purpose of the Equality Act is to give people rights, but whenever you give people rights, you also impose obligations on people who are involved in transactions with them, whether at work or in housing or the delivery of social advantages by government. There's a relationship of rights and obligations. And the issue that arises when you have a context of rights and obligations is that people must be able to understand what those obligations are. And we are in a moment of transition of political ideas where some people say that just describing me as a transsexual or a man or a woman doesn't adequately deal with my identity. And that's very clear to them, but not necessarily very clear to other people. And so this is a moment of political transformation. The idea of gender fluidity will become clearer to people. I get emails now in which sometimes people say his, him, or she, her after their name, and in other cases they say something more fluid than that because they want to be treated and to be identified in a more fluid way.
Aside from various interpretations of equality law, it seems to be the case that a great many public bodies have not scrutinised their Stonewall adjusted policies thoroughly. I put this question to James Caspian. What I don't understand in the making of this podcast throughout it, I do not understand how so many blue chip companies which have integrity and they are trying to do the right thing, they could not have just been blinded by Stonewall. They must respect them. They must be aligned with Stonewall's values. They couldn't be getting into this blind.
I think it's because they wanted to do the right thing. They wanted to be seen to do the right thing, to be LGBTQ, etc. friendly. Of course they did. They didn't see anything wrong with what they were being told. Oh, there are all these gender identities and so on and so forth. But they didn't dig deep. And there may have been people within those organisations, and in fact there are, who are worried about that narrative taking precedent, but who also, of course, know that they don't say anything now because they'll be attacked. So it's not to say there aren't people within those companies that don't realise that some of what they're being taught is questionable. But actually, initially, what happened was that nobody saw anything wrong with what they were saying. I mean, I remember in the early days, I might have come across some of that material and used some of it myself and hadn't seen anything wrong with it. But it's when you realise what has evolved, and it was when I realised about the large numbers of people detransitioning and what they were saying about their gender transitions and detransitions, and what they were saying about the influence of social media. And some of them even said they felt they'd been part of a cult. And then if you then dig into what's happening around this area, where you have situations where children can change gender at school and their parents aren't told. The parents are almost regarded as enemies if they question what's going on with their kids. An awful lot of things have happened that are really quite horrific around it, around human rights.
Robin Allen QC.
So, for instance, if one takes issues like dress codes, that's very often a subject of debate or a matter of great importance to somebody who treats themselves or considers themselves to be gender fluid. They don't necessarily want to be made to conform to historic dress codes as men or women. And if you have a situation in which that issue emerges, it could be important. But there's another side to it. Take prisons, for instance. We divide the prison estate into prisons for men and prisons for women. And people say, and it may well be true, that there are advantages, for instance, in terms of the regime in being in a, quotes, woman's prison. So you can see situations there in which the government may say, well, look, we have to, and the reason for having advantages in women's prisons may be related to issues of maternity. There may be other issues that are specific to that. And the government may say in that kind of context, for instance, that it's very important to divide the world into men and women, or transsexuals, males to female, female to males, so as we know which is the right place to put somebody. So that could be a situation in which a person who says, well, I'm neither male nor female, but the government comes along and says, well, that's okay, that's part of your personal life, but in order to deal with you as a prisoner, we've got to decide which of the two you are, because we've only got a male estate and a female estate, and you've got to be appropriately housed. So that could be, I'm not saying it would necessarily succeed, but it's quite likely to succeed, an argument by the government saying you've got to be one or the other in that kind of context.
Benjamin Cohen is a journalist and the CEO of Pink News. I asked Benjamin if it's true that, for example, a man can declare that they're a woman and enter female spaces like a changing room.
Obviously, there's the case, the Taylor versus Jaguar Land Rover case. There is case law relating to that's relating to non-binary people, because there is some
exactly, because in UK law, sex is binary.
Sure, but also UK law, the way that the legal framework works in the country is case law is really important, and there is case law. So, and it's a case that hasn't been appealed, so it is the standing case law, which is the Taylor versus Jaguar Land Rover case, which was last year, which found that non-binary people fall under the protected characteristics of gender reassignment in the Equality Act 2010. So, as that is the case, whether you're calling it gender identity, gender reassignment, whatever you want to call it, there is actually a case.
Yeah, and Benjamin, you're citing that case and that case law. David went to the Equality and Human Rights Commission, and they warned against people citing that case law as suggesting that that's the established position. What did they say, David? Just read it.
On that point of that Taylor versus Jaguar Land Rover verdict, the tribunal said that gender reassignment was intended to cover a spectrum moving away from birth sex, and that people who identify as non-binary and gender fluid fall at different points in that spectrum. But they say this was a first stage ruling by an employment tribunal and does not set a precedent for other tribunals or courts to follow.
So that's the point. Does not set a precedent.
You'd say that, but let's see, has another case been brought, David and Stephen?
But that's the Equality and Human Rights Commission. That must bear at least some weight to this.
So may I ask a question? If you are a non-binary person, so I was speaking to a non-binary person who works for me today, and we currently aren't in an office due to the pandemic, and we've grown the team significantly, so we can't go back to our old office, but we're thinking very carefully about our new office. But our policy has been for the last 10 years, that any office that we're using must have gender-neutral toilet facilities. Can I ask you, which toilet do you think, do you think it's appropriate that a non-binary person should use a binary toilet?
That is really not the issue here, because the issue is about the issue is about the law and what the law currently says. And if Stonewall want to change, our point is, if Stonewall want to change the law, Why don't Stonewall just say the law as it is does not protect non-binary people? We want to change that.
My belief and the way that I would interpret, regardless of what the Equality and Human Rights Commission have said, is I would, as an employer, I would look to employment tribunal decisions to use that as a guide to what. Look, I appreciate you're not an employer. I am. So an employer wants to avoid...
I am an employer.
Okay, but well, then you know this. Employers want to avoid being taken to court and being subject to employment tribunals. They want to do everything they can to make their employees happy and feel valued and welcome.
And isn't the risk in that, though, Benjamin, because this stuff hasn't been properly tested, because there isn't legislation around it, actually some of these employers who are taking that approach of going above and beyond the law could now be opening themselves up to legal action from women who are saying, actually, my sex-based rights under the Equality Act, which is very clear that there can be single-sex spaces provided under the Equality Act, is being impeded.
Oh, but we're talking about all sorts of different things. So what happens if shouldn't an employer also provide gender-neutral facilities as well?
They don't have to lawfully do so, do they?
Well, that was one of the debates that was in the Jaguar Land Rover case. But the thing is, I'm asking you whether it's legal. I'm asking you, so Stephen, as an employer, I don't know how many people you employ, but if you have a non-binary staff member, should they not be provided with a toilet facility that is appropriate for them to use?
Well, look, if I was thinking about that, right, and I was reading what Stonewall, if I engaged Stonewall in this, they would be intimating to me that it is a lawful requirement to do so, and it is not. And you've got lots of these companies thinking that Stonewall are the experts, and Stonewall are not the experts.
I completely get the point, but in the documents that you sent me, I didn't see anything which said, and there may be other ones that you found, where Stonewall is saying that anything is the law. I think it talks about best practice policy or like best practice or something, but I'm not sure it says it's the law.
Some of this stuff's been in the media recently, and Stonewall put out a statement on all of this, and they tried to defend their position in response to the accusation that they were misinterpreting the law.
Sure.
They said they used the term gender identity to help explain who is protected by the law and who is protected with regard to the HRC code of practice. So we asked the HRC about this, and we said, does the HRC consider the term gender identity to be interchangeable with the term gender reassignment in the context of the Equality Act? Because that's pretty important. Because gender reassignment is a very narrow interpretation of what it is to be trans. Gender identity is much broader and includes different gender identities. It's not just about sex or transitioning between sexes. The Equality and Human Rights Commission said, no, it doesn't. And they say, while terms such as trans status and gender identity are in common parlance and are related to the protected characteristic of gender assignment, they have no specific legal meaning in this context.
But can I ask you a question? If someone was... No one is born... no one is assigned non-binary at birth or tends not to be. There's obviously been some celebrities that have done that with... chosen to do that with their children.
But you couldn't be assigned... But Benjamin, you couldn't be assigned non-binary at birth. I mean, how on earth could you assign a baby as non-binary?
So at birth, it is... Well, it's a requirement when a child is born that their birth is registered, and it is a binary, so either as male or female. If later that child, that individual as an adult, goes on to decide to discover that they are non-binary and they identify as non-binary, they are on a gender, so they have their gender and their gender identity is different to that at birth. So in my view, I'm not a lawyer, but in my view as an employer, I would consider that is compliant with the Equality Act.
Stonewall have they not? And we've asked Stonewall detailed questions in all of this. Have Stonewall not been interpreting the law in the way that they want the law to be, rather than the way the law exists? And how is that helping any of the people that they represent? Is it not better to argue for a change to the Equality Act, a change to all these laws?
Well, I don't know. I haven't seen all of the details, so I don't know exactly what Stonewall says to employers, and the language that you thankfully shared with me, doesn't have some of this exact language in. So I would say that it is better to think about what is best practice, and I wouldn't be advocating for describing something as the law if there is any debate about whether it is the law. However, as we found with our discussion on this, and when I've gone and spoken to people, I've had different viewpoints advocated to me about what is or is not required by law, but it is the case that as an employer, providing adequate facilities for people to relieve themselves while at work is a duty that you have as an employer. And not allowing people to do that could cause people to have there could be serious medical repercussions if people find that they are uncomfortable or unable to go to the toilet while at work.
But without giving clear guidance on the law, aren't Stonewall leading employers into a position where these employers are accepting their guidance, they are changing the language, and how are those employers not leaving themselves open to a court case from the other side, from people who say, you are infringing on my sex-based rights?
I don't know, but there would obviously be very interesting court cases if this happened.
We did ask Stonewall a series of detailed questions on their interpretation of the Equality Act. They did not answer those specific questions. Instead, they said this in a short statement provided to ourselves.
All our guidance on the Equality Act, including using the term gender identity, is based on the Equality and Human Rights Commission's Equality Act Code of Practice, which was recently reaffirmed in the High Court.
We had asked Stonewall detailed questions on that specific point. We asked Stonewall for details about the High Court ruling they referred to, because they've made this claim before. No answer. We asked them to explain how it supports their interpretation of the Equality Act. They didn't answer the question, except to restate the very point we had questioned. We told Stonewall that the Equality and Human Rights Commission have stated that the terms gender reassignment and gender identity are not interchangeable when it comes to the Equality Act. We told them that the EHRC don't agree with their interpretation, and that terms such as trans status and gender identity have no legal meaning in relation to the Equality Act. We asked how, therefore, did Stonewall stand over its assertion that the term gender identity explains who is protected by the Act. No response other than this.
All our guidance on the Equality Act, including using the term gender identity, is based on the Equality and Human Rights Commission's Equality Act Code of Practice, which was recently reaffirmed in the High Court.
Just a final thought, Robin. Would you like to be in court trying to defend the position of the Scottish Government or the Welsh Government when they say gender identity is a protected characteristic?
I wouldn't, because it's not. It's not a protected characteristic as defined by the Equality Act 2010. Not put like that.
Still to come, they refused to answer first time, but we got it on appeal. What the media regulator Ofcom was saying to Stonewall behind the scenes. That's episode 9. But next, trans and non-binary people debate some of the big issues we've discussed in this podcast so far.